Hello, everyone. We will wait just another minute or so as folks continue to trickle in. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat where you're calling in from, and we will get started in just a minute or so. Alrighty, we can go ahead and get started with a bit of an introduction as folks continue to trickle in. If you'd like to see live closed captioning, those are available by the button at the bottom of your screen. But yeah, we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our deep dive webinar on how transmission reform can improve renewable capacity and energy affordability. We'll be talking about a lot of different aspects of how transmission goes hand in hand with climate action and climate progress. And we can get started with a bit of an introduction on the next slide. So my name is Kristen Suarez. If this is your first time, my pronouns are she, they, and I'm the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate Exchange. If this is your first time, I'll send a link to our website where you can see more of the work that we do and how we support state climate policy action. On the next slide, just a bit of background. Climate Exchange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy across all 50 states. I sent the link in the chat. That's climate-exchange.org/network, where you can see recordings and recap articles from past webinars. You can see upcoming events where we'll have webinars where we'll delve into a specific topic like this. We also have monthly national calls, which are at the end of every month, and state climate policy actors, members of the networks, will give updates on what their states have been up to in the past few months on climate policy developments. And in all of these events and in all of our offerings, we really hope to create a space for state climate policy actors to connect on similar topics and to really learn from the vast knowledge and experience that's held within the national network of climate advocates. And I'll go ahead and send my link, my email in the chat if any of you want to follow up, if you have any questions about the work that we do. On the next slide, just a couple ways that we can support you in your work, or we can connect you to someone who can, and feel free to email me if any of these interest you. But we specialize in tracking and analyzing state climate policy. We can provide connections to experts and advocates working on similar issues as you. We can provide example states for certain types of climate policies. And you can also see our state climate policy dashboard, which tracks 62 state climate policies across all 50 states across 7 major sectors, and that's at climatepolicydashboard.org. That was just relaunched this past month, so very excited about that. On the next slide, last little bit of my introduction, I just want to let you know that Climate Exchange just launched our largest annual fundraiser. And so this is where we get a lot of the ability to do research and events that really support on the ground immediate needs of actors like yourselves. I'm going to go ahead and I just sent the wrong link in the chat. But you can go to carbonraffle.org if you want to support our work by buying a ticket for our fundraiser. It's, in our mission to achieve a rapid and equitable transition towards a zero emissions economy, the role of state advocates is more important than ever. We've always worked at the state level, and we're going to continue to work to support states. The proceeds from this webinar, the proceeds from this fundraiser fund webinars like this, but also our monthly calls. All of our offerings at the State Climate Policy Network are free, and you can learn more at carbonraffle.org, but you can win a entirely free, all fees paid for electric vehicle of your choosing. And we can go to the next slide. Today, we'll jump into our webinar now. Today, we've invited an amazing panel of speakers to talk about what states need to know in terms of the overlap of transmission, reform, and modernization, and a lot of our goals as climate advocates. And so before I get into the introduction of our speakers, just a logistical note, feel free to use the chat box as a space for connection, for sharing links or information about yourself. But if you have any topic-related questions for the panelists, please submit those at any time through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you submit those questions through the chat, they might get lost. But if you submit them through Q&A feature, panelists might be able to see and respond to them throughout the webinar, or we'll be able to get to them during our Q&A portion at the end, time permitting. Also, as always, this webinar is being recorded. If you have to hop off at any point, or if you know someone who wanted to make it but couldn't, we will be sharing the recordings and slide via email, and they'll also be posted on our website along with a recap article summarizing these lovely presentations by the end of the week. So we can get into our call now. So our agenda for today, we have Alice Madden from Audubon, who's going to be talking about transmission and climate progress. Then we'll hand it over to Bev Bendix from RMI, who will be talking about how transmission goes hand in hand with grid reliability. And then lastly, we'll hand it over to Anjali Patel from David Gardiner and Associates, as well as, acting as a consultant for ASEG, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, who will talk a bit about transmission and energy affordability and the impact on kind of the economic side of things. So thank you all. We can go to the next slide, and I'll give a further introduction for our next speaker, Alice. Alice Madden is the Senior Director of Climate Strategies for the National Audubon Society, where she oversees efforts to achieve the organization's strategic goal of influencing the rapid and responsible onboarding of 100 gigawatts of clean energy and additional transmission. Alice's many previous roles include serving in the Colorado House of Representatives as Majority Leader, then as Climate Change Advisor to Governor Bill Ritter, as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Intergovernmental and External Affairs at DOE, as well as various positions across the Center for American Progress, the University of Colorado School of Public Affairs and School of Law, and Greenpeace. So I will hand it over to you, Alice, to kick off our presentation. And yeah, thanks so much. I think we can stop screen sharing. I think Alice has some slides, but as we pull those up, I'll just let you all know, if you're aware, this is the first webinar in our series where we're focusing on transmission and climate. I just sent the link to that in the chat. We'll be having more webinars like this one and other offerings that really focus on where climate advocates can plug into transmission reform and modernization efforts. So I'll hand it over to you, Alice, to get us started.
Hey, thank you so much, and hi, everyone. I was really excited to be asked to join today's webinar. And I know the events of last week are not what many of us expected or had hoped. But what that does mean is the work, climate work at state level, is more important than ever. And I wanted to just start on a personal note. I work for National Audubon Society, which is a very bipartisan, nonpartisan organization. But my background, as you might have heard, I've worked in policy and politics for decades. For the last 15 years or so, I've worked on climate and energy. And I've done that in every single political configuration you can imagine. Solid trifecta for conservatives, solid trifecta for majority, hybrid, you name it. And of course, under Trump's first administration, I was at the law school running an environmental law center. And I have to say, at times, I've had to force myself to be an almost delusional optimist to get out of bed in the morning. Otherwise, this work can be really discouraging. And right now, it might be easy to sort of think, oh, I need to reset our goals. But that's a luxury the planet simply cannot afford. Kirsten had mentioned to us, there's over 300 people signed up for this webinar. I hope that feeds your soul a bit. I know it does mine, because climate change doesn't care about political boundaries. It doesn't care who's in charge. And this work remains essentially so critical for every moment we have, right? Our window for progress is shrinking. So our fight must continue. We have to make progress where we can, when we can, because failure, as they say, is not an option. So luckily, in today's topic, expanding, modernizing the grid, this is actually critical climate action. And largely it's remained a nonpartisan issue. We'll see if that changes. So you might be wondering, I feel like when you look at the other speakers, it's like one of these things is not like the other, like why is Audubon here? You think of us as protecting biodiversity, preventing species from disappearing, and that is very true. But Audubon science shows that bird populations are feeling the impacts of climate change, even in protected areas like wildlife refuges. In fact, 2/3 of all North American species are at risk from climate change. And we all know that climate change requires decarbonization. And if we act now, we can improve the chances of over 76% of the at-risk birds and stem other biodiversity loss. So Audubon, several years ago, looked at how they could best add value to this fight. And they wanted to be for something. What could they utilize their science and data for? So they made a commitment to get involved with the rapid and responsible siting of renewable energy and the transmission needed to onboard that. So we've made a commitment to onboard 100 gigawatts of utility scale renewables and the accompanying transmission needed. And I think you all know, and you might not, there's plenty of renewable energy projects around the country, but they often sit in line called the interconnection queue for like 6 or 7 years. And during that time, their funding can fall apart. All kinds of things can happen to make those projects just never get online. There's lots of different issues that affect that, and we can talk more about that. But the bottom line is we need to modernize our grid, and we need to expand current capacity by 2 or 3 times more than we have now. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I wanted you to have a feel for what this system looks like. I know some of you are experts, some of you are not, but basically, you know, we have generation, which is changing. It used to be, let's say, in one spot, a coal plant. It's pretty easy to build lines from that coal plant and get the power where it needed to go. Now we have more distributed sources, wind, solar, and we need this new interstate highway system to take that power from where it's being generated to the end users. And we're woefully behind on that. So here are just some of the challenges that we're facing. Our current grid system, average line age is 40 years, and a quarter of the system is over 50 years old. Our planning is odd. Frankly, no one would have ever designed it the way it is now, but we have 3 separate grid systems. We have 12 planning regions. They don't necessarily talk to each other. The system is already obsolete, as I mentioned. It was designed for centralized power resources like coal that's near urban areas, and not for these more widely distributed utility scale projects that we need to build. The building, the planning, permitting, and construction of transmission lines takes years. And at least to date, we've been focused, a lot of states and utilities are focused on more low voltage lines and often in their own state. We're really missing an interstate aspect of this. And planning can be really piecemeal. There's been few incentives to date to promote long-term interregional planning to support resource sharing, and thereby improving reliability and reducing cost to ratepayers. If you look on the left, that chart with the ratings, this is Americans for a Clean Energy Grid rankings of various plannings in the sectors of the US. Obviously, no one has a great grade. So we have a lot more to do, and I know we'll get into that a little more over the next hour. So some of the things that we have focused on transmission is basically doing as much as we can with what we have already. What does our existing grid look like? We need to modernize what's there and maximize the grid efficiency. And there's lots of things we can do. You might hear the term GETS, that's Grid Enhancing Technologies. And there's a variety of things that we can do to make our existing grid more efficient. The other thing that Audubon is really trying to emphasize and prioritize is co-location on existing lines and utilization of existing rights of way, such as building lines on highways. Believe it or not, most states have prohibitions against building transmission lines along highways. There's an effort now to look at state legislators across the country and see if those obstacles exist and remove them. There's a group called Next Gen Highways you can look up if you're interested. They're working in various states. They've passed a bill in Minnesota. They're working in Illinois, Colorado right now, working with governor's office, departments of transportation to remove those obstacles. Because if you can build an existing rights of way, you're obviously going to do less environmental damage. We also support, of course, right now we're kind of looking at a whole new ballgame, right? So we are ready to defend against federal rollbacks. We're going to be closely monitoring what happens with permitting reform that would have probably been addressed during lame duck, but now that it looks like there might be a conservative trifecta, that probably will come up in the next session starting in January. I hope you all can closely monitor what's being proposed and submit comments. There'll be lots of new rules coming out of this administration. I think it's important that we all pay attention and devote the capacity we can to making a record. We hope that FERC remains strong, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They just came out with a new rule called 1920 that should, if implemented, really help with that long-term interregional planning that I discussed. And if you look to the left on this slide, this is from Connected West, but I really love how they put this together. And the takeaway I want you all to see here is upper left is our existing and planned routes in the Western US. I work nationally, but I live in Colorado, so I've been working in the Intermountain West specifically for a long, long time. So this is just a great personal interest to me. And you can see from each of the different scenarios what building a more sophisticated, interconnected grid would look like. And it looks a lot different than the upper left. So this is action that the states can take and to promote and get your governors and your state legislators to promote interregional planning. No matter what happens to the federal level, states, I believe, can still push this and make and work with their utilities, transmission, organizing structures to make this type of work happen. Just a little bit about our work, and I know there's folks who do a lot of different things on the line on watching the call today, but we work directly with developers and decision makers to ensure best siting and operation policies. And this has many ancillary benefits. Audubon doesn't want to be the excuse why a renewable energy generation site doesn't get built or a transmission site. And yes, all man-made, human-made structures kill birds, but these type of structures are actually very low. Less than 3% of all bird mortalities are caused by transmission lines. So we never want to be the excuse for stopping good climate action and decarbonization strategies. So that's another reason why we get involved. And if we can work with the developer on good siting and best practices like early outreach to affected communities, early tribal consultation when that is appropriate. We utilize our data-informed mapping tools to avoid and minimize and mitigate impacts, not just on birds, but on other species and habitat protection. And this is great for many reasons. It helps permitting actually occur faster. It can avoid lawsuits down the line. The other thing I think states should look at, just one example of many pieces of legislation I hope we see at the state level. There's about 12 or 13 state transmission authorities, but only 2 of them are really directed toward strategic planning and rapid deployment of transmission systems. And not just within their own state, but thinking about that interconnection with their neighbors and beyond. So I really suggest when you get a chance to look at New Mexico's transmission authority and Colorado's transmission authority. I think we have a lot to learn from all of those. I'm not going to spend much time on this at all, but I did want you to see, again, I mentioned, we don't want to be the excuse that people use not to build offshore wind or onshore wind or transmission lines. And you're going to hear a lot of disinformation over the next coming months. Like, wind creates bird cemeteries. The takeaway I want you to look at from this slide is these are solvable problems. And if Audubon is supporting this, these are not creating bird cemeteries. And we know that the greater good is decarbonization. That's what birds need. So we never want to be in that red herring that you can't do it because it's bad for birds. I wanted to just tell you quickly about one really great success story we had with line developer. And the line is called SunZia. It's going to be delivering 4,500 megawatts of wind from New Mexico to Arizona and California. Huge project. It was a gleam in someone's eye over 18 years ago. The original owner was not playing nice, didn't want to listen to anyone's objections, wasn't working with tribes, wasn't doing any outreach. So a company called Pattern Energy took over, and they opened their arms to input from conservation organizations and did outreach with tribes. So after 18 years, the construction recently began. But I want to just quickly say how we actually engage with developers, because we really do want other organizations to get involved and be part of these coalitions. So we provided guidance on routing, siting of towers, installation practices. On that slide before, you saw some of the things that we look at. We briefed leadership at the Department of Interior and the BLM on the impacts of the route alternatives that were being considered, and that helped advance the NEPA permitting process. And then Pattern Energy, I have to say, became really a model developer. They made several voluntary commitments as the project went on. They're using bird diverting technologies. They worked to co-locate the line along existing rights-of-way where they could. They changed some crossings to avoid multiple river crossings over the Rio Grande River. And they actually agreed to fund some bird-related research, which of course we were thrilled about. And they're testing some lighting developed at one of our sanctuaries to keep birds from hitting transmission lines at night. And in fact, we're working with Pattern now on a proposed line from Texas through Louisiana and Mississippi called Southern Spirit. And we're going to try to develop best practices, developer best practices with that project as a working model. In MISO region, I'm not sure how many of you live in the upper Midwest, but you might be well aware that MISO is probably one of the more organized regions in terms of building transmission. They announced an investment of $10 billion for 2,000 miles of new transmission lines. Most of these are in existing rights of way. So for a group like Audubon, our work is important, but as they move farther south and launch what they're calling Tranche 2.1, those will be in new areas. It'll be important for all conservation organizations and affected areas to really get involved to make sure that those brand new lines are built responsibly. But again, I mentioned we work directly with the developers, and we welcome everyone at the tables that we join and try to create as we look at these lines. And we get our members to support them. We talk about why conservation is climate action. And instead of opposing lines, because maybe they just don't want to look at it, we end up building support for lines like this. And again, this all reduces conflict later. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. Again, thank you so much for inviting me today, and I can't wait to hear from our other speakers.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was a lot of information in a small amount of time. I appreciate that. We will continue moving along. So we have our framework for transmission and climate, but we also want to think about how transmission reform really goes hand in hand with grid reliability, which is entirely a huge part of our future in general, clean energy or otherwise. And so I will hand it over to Bev Bendix, who is a manager in RMI's electricity practice. Her work focuses on unlocking solutions for equitably and affordably building the transmission needed to support our rapidly changing energy system. And she has over a decade of experience in electricity in both the private sector and state government, with a bachelor's in environmental science from RPI and a master's in public policy and management from Carnegie Mellon. So Bev, I'll hand it over to you to talk a bit about reliability today.
Thanks, Kristen. I do have a deck and I am screen sharing, so I'm gonna go ahead and pull that up. It's really nice to be online with all 100 of you. I am gonna do my best today, but I am on day 9 of COVID right now, which is a far way out, so it's fine that I'm here, but I'm still struggling a little. I still have a little bit of a cough and my voice is not entirely here. All right. How is this?
Beautiful.
Great. All right, so just a quick intro to RMI, who for folks who don't know about us, we're all about transitioning away from fossil fuels and transitioning towards the clean energy future. We work across all of these different sectors. We have lots of different ways that we do work, and we work across the entire US. My team specifically, so I work on our transmission focused team. We are very active in the West. As you'll see, I'm going to share an analysis example from the West. And in PJM, which is the Mid-Atlantic Transmission Planning Region. We do analysis and publish reports. We work on transmission planning, grid enhancing technologies. We work with the federal government. We work with state regulators and other state entities. So I want to just start out by, before I talk about reliability, talking about the many benefits of proactive regional transmission planning. So what our team focuses on for the most part when it comes to transmission planning is we would prefer proactive solutions that are either at the regional or interregional level rather than what we think of as a bottoms up approach where we plan by utility system and utility system. So this past, oh my gosh, I'm losing track of time, but I think it was this past spring, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued an order that is requiring proactive regional transmission planning following these 7 benefits. So I wanted to highlight these benefits for folks because these are benefits that regional transmission planning can provide. So when you're assessing, is a regional solution the least cost best solution for this region, I just wanted to flag 4 of them that in my mind are reliability benefits. So 1, can I meet demand and maintain reliability without overbuilding generation in all the different utility territories? Can we share power across borders and have it be more reliable that way and lower cost? Production cost savings. I mean, this is more about cost, but I think cost and reliability go hand in hand. You really can't have a conversation about with one about without the other, because you can meet reliability in a lot of different ways, but you can in some cases do it more affordably via better regional planning. And then mitigation against extreme weather events. When you have better connectivity between different regions or within your region, it can help provide resilience in extreme weather scenarios. And then it can also be a way to meet your peak power demand. So I'm going to just move forward from here. We like to call these the 7 transmission benefits, the 7 Knights of the Transmission Benefits Roundtable. And I'll just make one more point around regional versus interregional planning. If you look, so each of these borders, this is a transmission planning region. If you look across transmission planning regions, there's very little interconnectivity between regions. In this case, we're measuring this as how much transmission capacity is there as a percent of the demand within that region. And one thing to just note is there are very minimal venues available for even undergoing interregional planning. So I'm going to illustrate the value of regional planning via of regional diversity of resources for reliability by using an example from the non-RTO West. So what I mean by this is the parts of the West that are not California are not part of a regional transmission planning organization and can create an interesting use case for how transmission can support reliability. So there's two big drivers right now for why we really care about proactive regional planning. This can apply to the rest of the country, not just the West. So we're seeing a lot of increase in electricity demand, and that's expected to stay consistent in the years to come. And then many states do have clean energy targets, and this is changing the energy system as well. So the analysis that we did was we looked at the value of regional planning compared to isolated planning for meeting clean energy goals. So if you look at the left-hand side, if you can share across borders, different resources such as wind, hydro, and solar, instead of doing what we call bottoms up planning. So this is a bunch of different utility territories. They each do their own planning without a regional process. So the question is, if we can do this, if we can do coordinated planning, how much more affordably can we meet our clean energy goals? So we look at the cost of state A and B in isolation, and then the cost of state A and B as a pair. And before getting into the outcome of that analysis, why is this important? So I'm going to get a little wonky on grid planning right now. So the grid is currently the most challenging periods that it's facing are meeting what we call peak demand. So this you probably can't see my cursor moving, but this black line at the top there, the highest amount of electricity demand that the system is going to face. That was yesterday's challenge. And today's challenge is this idea of peak net load. So meeting the amount of demand that remains after you account for the amount of variable resources on the grid. So solar, wind, hydro, you could consider in that bucket to a lesser extent. Those are the challenges that we're dealing with today. Where we are headed with and what we need to deal with is trying to meet this black line that is not filled with the variable resources. So this period right now is it's actually a rare instance where there's 36 hours where it's low in-state solar production. And because of this extended period of time, it makes it difficult to meet this period of electricity demand through battery storage alone, through the technology that is commercial right now. So what our model has found is that in order to reliably meet this deficit, which is the gray period, we have to fill it in with what we call clean firm. So clean firm would be a technology like nuclear, geothermal, existing fossil fuel plants with carbon capture retrofitted onto them, or like hydro with pumped storage. And if we were able to use regional transmission to meet it, so as a pair of states rather than an isolated state, we could actually fill in with resources that were available at the same time. In this example, we're looking at Nevada and Colorado as a pair. So Colorado actually had solar or wind available at the same time that we could fill in with instead of filling in with clean firm. And the outcome here is, using the Nevada-Colorado example, is that you have this isolated portfolio. So I'm looking on the left side, the first bar would have 15 gigawatts of clean firm. And the cost impact of that is 9.2 billion. So I'm looking at the other bar graph now with this big chunk of gray. And it's actually 15% more expensive than the scenario. So $2 billion more expensive than the scenario where Colorado and Nevada had better transmission connection and went together as a pair. So we did this for 55 state pairs across the West, and it's different. The total cost reduction to meet reliability needs is different depending on which state pair you look at. The more difference in a geography, the better the cost savings is. So the best example is at the top here. We've got Washington and Nevada, and that's because not Nevada, New Mexico. Oof. And that's because New Mexico has great solar and wind, and Washington has great hydro, so they're very complementary to each other. So we're not proposing that there's a transmission line that goes 1,200 miles from Washington to Nevada, but we are proposing that regional planning across the West, better interconnectivity generally, is where you see the overall reliability and cost improvement that go hand in hand. So that's my example of reliability and cost for regional transmission planning. Because a lot of folks on this call were, it sounds like our state level, I wanted to give a very, very high level of what power PUCs have on transmission. So I'm not going to go through all of these on this slide, but this slide is to say that depending on if your state is in a regional transmission organization and whether or not they have an integrated resource planning process with the PUC, there are different, with PUC approval involved, there are different sets of power that they could have over transmission. So at a high level, this one is really the one I think is the most important, but states have soft power to engage in regional planning processes. Order 1920 compliance is undergoing right now, and they have power to engage as a state within that process. If they have a state level permitting approval process through what we call a CPCN, then they can support or not support certain projects through that process. Same with IRPs. And then mostly they can't engage on rates because they're mostly set by FERC. I just wanted to give one example of a state lever. So in the West, there's actually a transmission collaborative where states being involved in that transmission collaborative is going to give it the most power and the most sticking power possible. States also need proper resourcing, and there's a couple states that have electric transmission authorities. Depending on the state, that could be a good method for them or not. And I will leave it there. I hope that has been helpful.
Thank you so much, Bev. That was, again, another jam-packed presentation, and I appreciate all of that information. And that graphic of the Knights of the Round Table, it definitely got some love as well. And if you could possibly send a link to the study that you were discussing in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, and I'll put my email in the chat. I'll do like the whole link drop.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much to our first two presenters. We'll wrap it up with our last presentation. Again, kind of transitioning from thinking about reliability into affordability. These things are entirely connected. I'm going to hand it over to Anjali Patel, who's the Vice President of Clean Energy with David Gardiner and Associates, where she leads DGA's work to help Americans for a Clean Energy Grid expand long-distance transmission to support reliable, resilient, and more affordable energy. Anjali also focuses on providing companies, organizations, and governments with strategic guidance on policies that are needed to support decarbonizing the energy, transportation, and building sectors. So I'll hand it over to you, Anjali, to talk a bit about how this goes hand in hand with economics, affordability, things like that.
Thank you. And thank you to Kristen and the Climate Exchange for organizing this very important topic. I think transmission is front and center in a lot of people's minds, and it's really good to have discussions where we talk about what is happening, because it's also a very technical and complicated topic as well. So before going into the discussion on affordability and economics, I want to give just a little bit of background on DGA in case some of you weren't familiar with our work. We're a strategic consulting firm working on advancing diverse and practical decarbonization solutions across sectors. So we work in a number of sectors that have the highest emissions, including energy, industry, transportation, and commercial buildings. Our work includes supporting multi-stakeholder coalitions, providing policy and data analysis and strategic guidance, and operational support to nonprofit organizations. So we have a wide variety of work across a wide variety of sectors. As Kristen mentioned, DGA also helps support the work for Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. ASEG is a nonprofit organization focused on education and advocacy to advance the expansion, modernization, and integration of the high capacity grid. So integration means connecting regions, just like Bev was talking about earlier. ASEG is supported by a broad coalition of utilities, generation and transmission developers, consumers, environmental groups, representatives from labor and manufacturing sectors, energy think tanks, basically a lot of different organizations and companies who are all focused on why we need transmission and how we can do it cost effectively. And both of my fellow panelists organizations are also part of the ASEG's network. So it speaks to the broadness of our sector, or of our coalition. So want to start off with a statement that probably most of you know, but energy, and especially electricity, it's an essential service. So we need it to run our homes, our schools, hospitals, businesses, manufacturing, government, emergency services, phone, internet, social media, anything you can think of these days ties into electricity. It controls or is part of almost every aspect of our daily lives. So this in turn means that electricity needs to be affordable, because if you lack electricity, it impacts safety and health and can reduce economic opportunities. And transmission is an important component of making sure electricity is affordable and can support needed economic development. So energy demand has been increasing exponentially in the US, and I'm going to drop links to some of the studies as I'm talking about them. A recent Grid Strategies report found that in 1 year, between 22 and 23, grid planners nearly doubled their 5-year forecasts of energy demand. And that's due to a fair amount of interest in expanding our data center facilities, our manufacturing and industrial facilities. So there's a lot of large growth happening in the US. And just looking at the information, the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, we've seen over $175 billion in new investment in just battery manufacturing, supply chain, and EV components and assembly. So there's a lot more investment happening, but it's quite extensive. And each of these facilities translates to jobs and economic income for the states and regions they're located in. Here's a link to the more information about the IRA and BIL investments. So data centers, the manufacturing components are large, but data centers are going to place an even greater strain on our grid because they're doubling, in some cases tripling or quadrupling the amount of energy demand in a state. Some states, such as Virginia, are predicting that data centers are going to become half of their electric load. Now, data centers, they have their own reasons for high electric demand, especially if you're thinking about things like cryptocurrency or how the data, Google, Meta, Intel, all these big manufacturing, all these big data facilities need a lot of power to run their own systems, but they're also needed for cybersecurity, banking, hospital records, again, relating to much of our daily lives. So we don't always see how data centers support the day-to-day functioning of our own lives, but they're very important. And as more and more is moving to the network and to the cloud, we need more and more computing power. Unfortunately, but there isn't sufficient energy available to support integration of all of these manufacturing industrial data centers that are seeking to come online. We don't, in large part because we don't have enough transmission capacity to move generation from where it is or could be generated to where it's needed. And that insufficient access to power, it can impact business decisions of where the companies want to locate it, and even whether they want to locate in the US at all. One region I've heard, they can't interconnect new high capacity load for 2 to 3 years. So that's a long way off when businesses are making decisions quickly. So on the economic end, we need transmission. On the affordability end, we also need transmission. It's no secret that transmission modernization is going to require significant investment. Each of these lines is quite extensive in terms of the amount of investment that goes into it. And those costs then get borne by ratepayers. But there are two important things to note. One is that there's a cost of not investing, and that cost of not investing in new systems will be even higher than the cost that we would put in to do the investment. So, for example, if you recall Winter Storm Uri 2 years ago, Winter Storm Elliott a year ago, both of those had significant damage and rolling blackouts in the regions that they hit, Uri and mainly Texas. It did hit through the Midwest, but because they had import power, what Bev was discussing before, they were able to import sufficient power to avoid rolling blackouts. Texas wasn't in the same case, and over 200 people died during that process. Not just cost, there's a safety consideration as well. When Elliott hit, it hit the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. The Southeast had rolling blackouts. Studies have found that if we had invested in a transmission line between Texas and the Southeast, it could have yielded $1 billion in value just over the short Uri duration, and another $95 million in value going the opposite way. Power goes both ways on lines. So had we had it in place during Elliott, Texas could have exported their power to the Southeast with nearly $95 million in value, not in addition to saving lives and protecting health and safety. So the benefits far outweigh the costs, both for avoided costs as well as just benefits we get from a stronger transmission system. As we know, the transmission system, as Alice mentioned, it's quite old. The generation system is also aging. And so as transmission investment goes up, transmission is one component of our bills. As transmission investment costs go up, the power costs should go down. So because it will lead to the interconnection of cheaper and cleaner resources, which are less expensive than some of the pre-existing thermal longer duration resources that have been around for some of them over 60 years. We have a generation system that really needs to be evolving as well. DOE recently put out a study that found the hundreds of billions of dollars of net benefits from large-scale transmission development. So they have, I'm going to drop a link to the DOE study. The National Transmission Planning Study just came out last month. They found that accelerated transmission expansion can lead to national electricity system cost savings of 270 to 490 billion through 2050. So, exponentially more than the cost that we're looking at, and that incremental investments, which would be offset by the fuel generation and storage costs, would yield approximately $1.60 to $1.80 for every dollar spent on transmission. So real savings for ratepayers. I'm just going to end with a couple of things of what does it mean to have a well-planned system. We keep talking about well-planned, cost-effective, and Bev and Alice went over some of this before too, but just a few items to add to that list. One is that we plan forward rather than reactively. So right now, many regions are still planning for potential reliability violations that have happened in the past or that will happen in the near term, rather than looking at what our system needs going to be in the future. When we build transmission lines, they're 40 to 50-year long assets. We want to make sure that we can maximize the use of these assets going forward. So we need to look at demand forecasts more comprehensively, look at expected electrification, data center manufacturing demands that will increase load. We also need to look at what generation is retiring. And so what are the power system changes that are going to come onto the network that we need to be planning for? We need to look at both expansion and modernization opportunities. As Alice mentioned, there are grid enhancing technologies and advanced transmission technologies, other advanced transmission technologies such as advanced conductors. Those all help expand the capacity of the existing grid or the capacity over existing routes. But that's not alone is not going to be sufficient. Even if we expand the capacity, we still need to have expansion of the network itself with the development of new lines. So neither solution, neither modernization or expansion or silver bullets in themselves. We need to plan for both. And lastly, we need federal and state policies that support comprehensive transmission build out, that streamline siting and permitting to reduce bureaucratic efficiencies while respecting environmental and community protections. And I saw that there was a comment about NIMBYism. That's one of the biggest reasons that lines don't get built. And so helping communities understand the purpose of the line, but also ensuring that they're getting benefits and have a right to meaningfully participate. All of that is very important. ASAG recently released a report outlining policies, state transmission policies that experts have shared would be needed to help support transmission expansion and modernization. So just dropped a link to that report. The transmission authorities that Alice and Bev mentioned are outlined in the report. There's more information on where to get more information on them in there. And then ASAG is also going to be releasing early next year a report on strategic community engagement and best practices for community engagement. This was developed through conversations with a diverse array of stakeholders, including transmission developers, environmental justice, indigenous, labor advocates, agricultural advocates, environmental and natural resource advocates. And so it's a consensus set of best practices that folks that would help meaningfully engage communities, ensure they're getting benefits. The ones that are impacted directly will get benefits from the line. So I dropped a link to a fact sheet on that report, and the report should be out early next year. ASAG also has a lot of other resources on transmission. So numerous fact sheets on different issues that are being brought before Congress. Order 1920, there's fact sheets for each region. There's some reports in there too. So hopefully that'll be helpful as you investigate transmission issues more.
All right. Thank you so much, Anjali. And just to respond really quickly, this webinar is recorded. The recording will be sent out via email and posted on our website by the end of the week. We'll also have a recap article summarizing the details of these presentations, so no worries about getting all that down. Thank you so much to all three of our speakers. I think we covered a lot of what is a huge, huge, huge topic. So I appreciate all of you really keeping that high level, but giving us the details where needed. We've had a lot of questions, and Bev has been a champ at answering a bunch of those. So feel free to take a peek at I think there's 8 answered questions there. But I'll bring it to the three of you. There's some questions around why the interconnection delay occurs, why it takes so long in terms of permitting and grid connection, and how much we actually can speed that up. Why is the delay occurring, whether that's like a physical or response, but yeah, why is the interconnection delay there is the question, I suppose.
Bev, did you want to take that first, since you partly answered in writing, or is your so it depends on the region. The different regions have different reasons for interconnection delays. In many regions, it's the way that interconnection queues, which is the line for new generators, is processed and how they're processing them. Some were processing based on first in, first out. So you're the first generator to come and say you want an interconnection right. You may take a while to get processed, so the person behind you is waiting until your whole all your paperwork, all your analyses, studies are done. Some regions are changed, like PJM filed for changes to their process because they found that was holding up the line quite a bit. In other regions, there isn't sufficient transmission capacity to put generators online, and that's causing network costs, which are the costs to when you have to upgrade a line to add more capacity on there, you might need to also upgrade not just the interconnection point, but the transmission line itself. And so those costs have been rising across the US, and Lawrence Berkeley Lab has done a number of studies on interconnection costs and found that they're getting so exorbitant that developers can't, it's not penciling out anymore for their projects. So again, it depends on the region, but those are two of the biggest issues in some areas. That's right. There's Alice's comment about business models don't help. There's utilities are often not supportive of building generation, especially in areas that are vertically integrated and the utilities own generation, transmission, and their distribution lines. They don't want competition in that area.
Great. Thanks so much. I think we have room for one more question, which is the top of everyone's mind in all things, which is how elections impact the kind of future of where we're hoping, at least on the federal level, of getting a lot of we had lots of bipartisan hopes and dreams. But yeah, if maybe, I mean, huge question, we have 2 minutes, but what are your kind of top of mind things that you're thinking about the future of potential, transmission, reform, modernization, things like that, coming out of the elections?
I'll just really quickly say that we need to probably rethink how we talk about this a little differently. We're here because we care about climate, and we can start talking about reliability, job creation, being ready to onboard these massive new energy needs that we heard about. So just thinking about more in terms of a sustainable economy versus a sustainable environment. It's kind of sad, but I would think, just make sure you realize who you're talking to and adjust your messaging accordingly. And I think I think transmission will still, and electricity needs can still make a lot of progress. We really do need that. The price of oil is low right now. There's going to be market reasons to keep building renewables. So I think we just keep our chins up and keep moving forward.
I'll throw in one more bipartisan point, which is one thing we've seen in our work working in the West is that there are actually regions in the West which can't build manufacturing facilities that they want to because there is not a sufficient grid infrastructure to even support the electricity needed. So I think there are a lot of reasons that transmission can be a bipartisan issue.
And I think our hope is that FERC Order 1920 continues to move forward and compliance continues to move forward. But what FERC Order 1920 outlined as best practices in transmission planning, and regardless of whether it comes from the federal government, the regional entities and states can still push for best practices in transmission planning. And so having states really take an active role in ensuring that we're building transmission collaboratively across states, not just within their state, that they're creating these integrated networks is going to continue to be just as important as action at the federal level.
I want to make one point that addresses some of the points that were made in the Q&A. I don't think the question is, do we need proactive transmission planning or do we need distributed energy resources? I think we need both. What you're really coming down to, if you're, I think like the more negative way to look at it is transmission or new gas plants. That is really the fight that we're fighting in many instances, especially with load growth.
All right, thank you so much. I am gonna go ahead and wrap us up here. I'm gonna quickly just launch a poll. If this was helpful for you, feel free to just mark whether this was a useful event for you and if you work on this topic so that we can make sure we're meeting your needs. Thank you so much to all three of you. This has been such a informative presentation. I can see in the chat alone that this has been really helpful for a lot of folks on the line. Also just really great coming out of last week to see how there are very clear ways that we can move forward and that we will move forward because we don't have the time not to do so. And there are 15,000 people in our network. And those are 15,000. Those are a small fraction of the people in our country that are really working on this night and day and who care about this issue. And we have been doing this work and will continue to do this work. So thank you all so much for your time. As I've said, a recap article and the recording will be sent out by the end of this week, probably in our newsletter. It'll also be posted to our website. Feel free to reach out to me. You all have my email if you have any questions, if you want to get connected to any of the speakers. I'll also note we have national monthly policy update calls where members in different states across the country will give updates on what's been happening in climate policy in their states. Our next call is next week. So if you want to tune in from California to, Rhode Island, what states are thinking about in terms of outcomes of elections and how they'll be moving forward. Thank you all again. I know we're 2 minutes over, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who answered our poll, but have a great rest of your day. Thank you to all three of you, and yeah, have a great rest of your week. Find some rest and some joy. We're going to be good. We're going to get it done. I'll see you all. Bye-bye.